Key Radio thanks Authority Heating and Cooling of Orem, serving residential and commercial HVAC needs throughout Utah County. Authority Heating and Cooling provides AC and furnace maintenance, repair and replacement, heat pumps, humidifiers, UV lights, and their complete system overhaul. Authority Heating and Cooling can be reached at 801-224-0777 or by going to authorityheating.com. That's authorityheating.com.
Good morning. Welcome to the Key Radio Morning Show. Happy Thursday. My name's Corey Pensabene, alongside of Heather Zander.
Hello, good morning. I'm sorry, I'm just laughing so hard because the mics are on, and all of a sudden I hear this little Scooby-Doo whoop. It's so cute.
It is always an adventure here at Key Radio. That is for sure. We are. Mike, you got anything to add?
Well, the cameras were on as well, Heather. So I went straight to the group shot here.
Okay,
so.
fantastic. So you saw me kind of dancing while we're waiting for the
Yeah.
music. This is great. Hey, folks, this is who you. We try to put on these cool facades. It's just not going to work. You know the real us here. It's great.
But hey, the good thing is, you know that if God can use us, He can use anyone.
He can use you too.
It's good.
Oh, amen, amen. Oh, man. Okay, let's see. A couple of things I want to share with you, dear friend, and there's a couple events that are going on. One of them that's coming up this Sunday, September 1st at 6:30 p.m. is a free concert at Fellowship Bible Church, the Lawn in Linden. Oh, wait a minute. Fellowship Bible Church in Linden on the Lawn. There we go. Prepositions get a little messed up sometimes. But anyway, it's a free concert. The band is called The Riverside. They hail from California, and it's just some folk music. It's great, family-friendly, environment-friend, low-key. It's just going to be great. So again, that is going to be Sunday at 6:30 p.m. at Fellowship Bible Church in Linden, Utah on State Street. The other thing that I just discovered this morning, and I'm pretty excited about this as well, is the second annual Genesis Pregnancy Resource Center fundraiser event. If you don't know Genesis Pregnancy Resource Center, they're in Price, Utah, and it's a walk for life. This is going to be held on Saturday, September 28th, and check-in is bright and early at 8 a.m., and you start walking, my friend, at 8:30 a.m., but it's going to be on the Price River Walkway, so that's kind of cool, right?
Yeah, that's a beautiful spot.
Yeah, and I don't know how long it is though. I don't know. I have a lot of questions.
I remember it from last year, and I don't think it was that far. I mean, we didn't go, but we had Greg and Sherry.
Yeah, Lewis.
that
When they
went.
were here, and they just really enjoyed it. They thought it was just lovely. It was a $15 participant fee, which is what, peanuts, right? And it includes a T-shirt. And I'll tell you what, that like pretty much covers the T-shirt. So the other thing too, friend, that you get friends and family to sponsor your walk as well. So you could get the registration form, and then you just go to your friends and say, hey, I'm going to be walking, and you should give me money to do that so I could give it to the Pregnancy Resource Center.
It's great.
Isn't that how it
Who
works?
wouldn't go for that?
I remember when I was a kid, was it like grade school or something? It was jump rope for the heart, American Heart Association or something like that, right? And so you just take your little paper to your grandma and grandpa and your aunts and uncles and say, hey, I'm going to be jumping rope for an hour or something. And then they would say, okay, you should do that, and I'll give you $5. And then you could give it to, do you remember that, Mike?
I do remember
Did
that.
you participate in that?
Oh, I'm sure I did.
I don't remember actually participating. I think I thought, I'm not asking
You just took
people for
Grandma's money? And
Yeah. I got to go to the Dairy Queen. No, I'm pretty sure I didn't. Well, maybe I was a thief. Who knows? It was a long time ago, and I had those tendencies as a child. All that to say, though, I think that this is a great way to, a few things. Number one, to raise funds for something that is just so very important. And what a great community service, right? First off, people they need resources, right? And sometimes people don't have resources when they find out they're pregnant or what have you. And so this is something that actually shows love, not just to the unborn baby, but also to the mom and the dad and so on. on. So people there are just absolutely loving. The other thing too is it's a way to like really just get to know each other, right? When you're raising funds for something that you all share an interest in common, first off, and then you get to, oh, hey, my name is, and you meet new friends.
Yeah, which is good. It's always good to make new friends. And if I could just say this about this particular type of ministry and business, so many of the women that come in, my wife works for a different pregnancy resource center, and so many of the women that come in, they don't have a lot of support. I mean, that's a pretty common thing, meaning the boyfriend or the husband is kind of MIA or encouraging even often, hey, let's not keep the baby. That's a fairly common occurrence. And so to help these pregnancy resource centers be a source for these women who are really alone a lot of times in this kind of situation, it's a really helpful ministry. And so we talk about Roe v. Wade being overturned and all the things that went on with that. The battle is really just beginning in many ways because we still want to come alongside people. And so it's not just a political statement being made or a law being passed. It's really, an effort that we're making to love these women and their families, their babies on the front lines,
And there are so many critics who, when Roe v. Wade was overturned, they're like, what do you people do to help these people? And it's like, well, we've been doing it for decades. It's like we're there. Just because the media doesn't want to shed light on the fact that there are people who care for you doesn't mean they aren't there. And that's what I really appreciate about the Genesis Pregnancy Resource Center and also the Salt Lake City one, the one in American Fork, and so on, and also in Vernal. The point is they're there and they care about people. This isn't like, let's get you into the door. They're not motivated by financial gain. It's just, they just say, hey, listen, you are important. You were created in the image of God. You have value, and that little person inside you has value too. And it's hard. Life is hard. Being a parent in general is hard. But you know what? You're not alone. Yep. You're not the first person to find yourself in this predicament. You won't be the last, but let's just do this together. And I really appreciate the heart and sentiment of that. So all that to say, Genesis Pregnancy Resource Center, their annual fundraiser event that is going to be happening on Saturday, September 28th, along Price River Walkway. And that's on Carbon Avenue, just so you know. So for more information, go to their website, or you can contact us. We'll be announcing it. And I don't know, I'm pretty excited about this. I'm just going to see what my calendar looks like and see if I can even participate. And I might go up to you and say, hey, give me money so I can do this. Guess who's in the studio? Oh, our good friend, Pastor Rudy Rodriguez of City on a Hill in Provo, Utah.
Yes.
Thank
Good
you
morning.
for coming in. Busy morning or just a normal morning for you?
Just a normal morning, kind of.
Yeah.
I'm not, just getting used to the Tuesday thing, and then.
Oh, that's right. And then I'm like, I threw a wrench at you. I'm like, hey, how about Thursday?
Yeah, like, all right, I can do that.
Well, thank you.
Well, we appreciate it.
Yeah. So I'm just like, the fifth, normally we have, like our regulars, like, it's so much fun. And I love having regulars because that means that I know that I will be able to talk to you.
Yeah.
But then on this past month, we didn't have you on it because we were gone. And then like, well, wait a minute. How about this Thursday? And you were so gracious and said yes. And I was so happy. So thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for fitting us into your schedule.
Yeah, I'm honored to be here. That's awesome.
Anything happening over at Calvary City on a Hill in Provo?
We are continuing on. Just a couple of weeks ago, we had a couple of baptisms, and that was always fun. And
Very
and
cool.
And the in the very temperate Provo River. That's always fun. That's always
Temperate.
Where in the Provo River? Like
there's a little park that we go to, and we found a great little spot there where the water, even when it's generally running, it's about hip high, so it's just about perfect for that.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's little pools there where you can.
It's not rushing down the mountain and like carrying away ducks and people and none of that.
I actually went cold plunging when it was almost up to the banks.
Oh.
Yeah, when it was almost to the top there. And it was a little bit, it was kind of exciting because it was flowing so fast and so hard and so high that, but I know the area, so I knew that there's a little spot.
I'm like, I don't want to see you in the news, Fred. You be careful. You be careful. Wow. Well, that's exciting. Baptisms and friend, Boy, we talk about baptisms like they're the saving thing. A lot of times they're like, "Have you been baptized?" And it's like, "Well, yeah, that means I'm good with God." Do you know what baptism really means? And I think that's a really important thing to hover on just for a moment, because everything that we talk about is always based on the gospel. But
Right.
a lot of times we hear that's the gospel truth, and it doesn't matter what we're talking about. Somehow we manage to get the word gospel in there.
Yeah.
But what is the gospel, and how does baptism fit into all of that?
Well, the gospel is, to be very specific, is what Paul says. It's the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus on the third day, all according to Scripture. That's the actual gospel. And so it begs the question, well, why is that important? And it's because all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And so we have that. And when we see in the book of Acts, as we see on a fairly consistent basis, people would hear the gospel, they would respond. God is regenerating them, and then in their response, the very next step was to be baptized. Mm-hmm. And one of the differences is the regeneration is a personal, interpersonal thing between you and God.
Oh, I like that interpersonal
But
thing. Good.
but the baptism is more of a public declaration, and in countries where the gospel is not smiled upon, when you do that, you can say you're a Christian all day long, weeks at a time, years at a time. Nobody cares. The minute that you do your public baptism, then they take it seriously. So they see it as a kind of almost as a declaration of war. So the public declaration is very important, and we give a chance to have people declare what it is that they're, why we're baptizing them. That's one of the questions. Mm-hmm. With little kids, it's a little bit different, because it's kind of, do they really get it? Mm-hmm. I believe that they do, because the Spirit is the one who does that in them. Mm-hmm. But with adults, I take a little bit more time and ask them questions and a little bit more probing. And if they answer to the affirmative, then I'm saying, I'm taking your word at it, and so are these people. And we're before God and his angels too. So, let it be what it's going to be. But so that's what the baptism is. And we do it, as Jesus said, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. And when we do it, as they're going down, I always include buried in the likeness of Christ's death, risen in the likeness of his resurrection to new life. Mm-hmm. And then we, pray for them, and that's just how we do it. Mm-hmm. So that's what baptism is. It doesn't save you, but it's a declaration that you believe that God has saved you, in our opinion. And so that's how we do things.
Otherwise, it's just a bath, right?
Correct.
Right, yeah. It's like, what I really like about the image or the visual of the baptism is the helplessness, in a way, right? Because you're standing in the water, and you got one or two people who are helping you to go backwards, right? And if you've ever been in water and you go backwards, like, these people are bringing you down, and it's like a show of the death barrel, right? And but you're still at the mercy. They are the ones who have to pull you up. You don't pull yourself up. You try with your legs, and you look like kind of like you're struggling like a little fish or whatever. But the idea is that Jesus is the one who does all the saving. Jesus is the one who, in essence, raises us from the dead, right? Nothing that we do. So it's also a visual of just our submitting to the power of Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So I just really appreciate just the whole thing of it. So, friend, I hope that makes a little sense to you, because we've been talking about, it just seems to be the season of baptisms, right, lately. And it just gives us, our hearts just rejoice when we hear this, because we know that it's not that they are wanting to get saved. They've already said, I'm a believer in Jesus. I am following Christ. They've already repented and believed, and now this is just, like you said, this is that public declaration, and just causes us to rejoice. So when you see somebody baptized, it's not like, hey, welcome to the family. They're already part of the family. This is just obedience to Christ, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. They're just basically saying, regardless of the crazy people around me, I'm joining their family. So that's kind of the cool part about it. Yeah.
Well, I think that it's funny, because I do think that what you were talking about, Pastor Rudy, with in foreign countries, how it's this next level in a sense of seriousness. Yeah. But I do think that there is a similar thing in our culture still, where, people can make a profession of just, I acknowledge these things. But when they care enough to go through the process of talking with the pastor beforehand and then actually publicly declaring, there is another level of, again, it has nothing to do with actual salvation, but it's like, it's encouraging, because you're like, all right, their lips are matching their life now. They're doing something about it. And so I do think that there is a level of encouragement in that.
Yeah, yeah, and you might even look at it as a declaration in the spiritual as well, because you're declaring to the spiritual world, because our struggle's not against flesh and blood, but you're declaring to the powers that be, the authorities, the rulers of this present darkness, that you're in the battle, you're in the fight, and I think that is also in addition to being the very physical reality of what we're doing, it's also the spiritual. And so, yeah, I think it's one of those things as well.
Oh, I love it. So there's a great seriousness about this, a sacredness, if you will, as well. And I love how you said you're basically declaring war. And some of that might have jarred us a little when you said it. But when I think about it, it's like, yeah, because we've said, you know what, there's a line, and we are basically on Jesus's team, right? But
Yeah.
I mean, if you're talking about war, but it's like, there is a spiritual battle going on, and we see that. And if you are a Christian or a person who says, yeah, if I'm a believer in Jesus Christ, then all these things are going to go well for me. And we hear about the health and wealth and the prosperity and all of that. You're going to be sorely disappointed, because even Jesus, look at his life, and he's like, if they don't like me, how they're not going to like you either. I mean, if they're crucified our master, right?
Yeah.
But he's overcome the world, which is,
Amen.
So I hope that encourages, I hope that helps you, friend. It is a good, sweet thing to be a child of God, and you are a child of wrath unless you place your trust in Jesus Christ and Jesus alone, the biblical Jesus too. So we want to make sure we get that right.
Amen.
You are in the book of Isaiah.
Yes.
And I when I texted you, I'm like, hey, we'll just talk about what you talked about on Sunday. And then I'm like, oh, maybe I should have asked what passage that was. But I looked it up. You're in Isaiah 57. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And last Sunday, you were on 6 through 13-ish.
Yep.
Is that
Yep.
okay? So I'm on the right.
You are, yeah.
Yes. And what it's real here, friends. It really is. But it's really fascinating because there is a deep warning in this particular passage talking about, are you for Jesus or are you for basically idols?
Yeah, exactly.
And boy, this is actually really pertinent to today's day and age.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it's where God is very patient and long suffering. He also gives many, many warnings, and that's the thing that comes out of there. And going back to a few months ago, where Isaiah 52 and 53 are so pivotal. Because it introduces a whole new perspective. Because up until then, all the way through the 51 chapters before that, you have this speckling of this person, and every once in a while the lens goes from way out here to looking at all the people of Israel, and it just focuses in on this one person. Then it focuses back out. But then 52 and 53, it really just explodes with this idea of who this person is.
And that person being the Messiah.
Person being the Messiah,
Okay.
yeah. And after that, everything else is kind of pivotal. So it has almost a dual kind of prophetic voice from that point on. And so it's speaking to the immediate in God's eyes. It's still a little bit further down the road. But it's actually introducing also the idea of more and more, it's including the person that's going to come and how it's going to affect not just the people of the time, it's going to affect the world. And that's kind of what it does, and it explodes in that manner. And hopefully our people aren't sick of me doing it, but I keep reminding them of this. It's a dual-fold. It's speaking to the immediate, but it's also speaking to the future. And in that case, it was 600 plus years that it was going to happen. And when everything after that point, from that chapter on where we're at, has this idea built into it. And I praise God that this week we do communion on the first Sunday of every month, and it's just fitting where we're going to be in the rest of the chapter, and we'll see if we get it, get through it. But it's we go through all those warnings, all the things, and all the fearfulness of God, because He is just and holy and righteous, but He ends, we ended with a little bit of an upswing where he says, but regardless of all this stuff, the one that trusts in me, he's going to be safe. He's going to inherit the land. And that's the amazing thing. And so, and everything from there, for the next few verses are just replete with that joy and that rejoicing and that hope. And then it ends on a little bit of a sour note. But it's a reminder. It's a continuing reminder. Hey, I'm God, and this is who I am. And if you trust in me, things will be well. It doesn't mean that we're going to be healthy, wealthy, and wise all the time. But it does mean that we're going to be well. And we don't need to fear because we're trusting in what he said. And the gospel is, why, going back to that, what we started out with, what was the gospel? Well, why did Jesus die? To take our sin. He faced the wrath that we deserve so that we don't have to. And that's the amazing thing.
The fantastic and amazing thing about Isaiah, too, is that as you're reading it, friend, there's a lot of prophecy. I mean, it is just crazy full of prophecy and prophecy that has come true. We have that benefit today to look back and say, oh my, this is so specific and all of this happened. It's amazing. But the context of Isaiah 2 is at a time where Israel was pretty much at its worst, right? I mean, Israel was just... These are supposed to be God's chosen people. God chose Israel to usher in the Messiah. And why? Well, obviously not because they were wonderful, spiritual people. I mean, it is amazing how God had done all these things, pulling them out of Egypt, leading them by pillars of fire and pillars of a cloud, all of that, just always with them. His presence, like tabernacle, he was there with them. All of these amazing miracles of bringing in manna from heaven, and they're all thirsty, and then all of a sudden just water pours out of a rock. I mean, amazing things that God had done. Amazing things. And they were always to remember, but they forgot. I don't know if it was they forgot. It was actually just willful disobedience to the God who saved them. In fact, it was so depraved. Like, as they're walking, it wasn't even like a week, and they're like, oh, remember how wonderful Egypt was? It's like, people, they were killing your babies. I mean, this is terrible. But that's, and we sit there and we look at Israel, and we say, oh, those Israelites. But friend, that's our heart. That is just an ugly reflection of all of us. And we have to remember that before we get a little too carried away with, casting stones in our own little glass houses, right? But the Isaiah was written at a time where it was just, I mean, God, you talk about long suffering. It was like God would save them, and then they would say, "Yay, God!" And then all of a sudden, they're going to other countries' idols. I mean, and demonic stuff. I mean, absolutely awful. And God then would say, and it's not like God didn't warn them. He's like, "Well, if you go away from me, this is what's going to happen." And they're like, "Okay," and then that would happen. It's like, but God was so long suffering. He was merciful, because the minute that they decided that they weren't going to follow God, God could have just said, "Okay, you're out of here. I'll pick another people." But he didn't do that.
Right.
He made a covenant with them, and he knew that they, I mean, he's sovereign. He's all-knowing. He knew that they were going to be disobeying him in ugly ways, and yet God chose to deal with them. God chose to love them. And in Isaiah, this is the time where they were being exiled.
Yeah, this is the Babylonian exile that he's talking about in particular, and historically they were almost to the end of that, and they were going to be to the end of that, and that's what he's saying, that they had slipped into paganism, and one of the things that I think sometimes we don't think about is when they were in Egypt, they were surrounded by idolatry, and this is all that they had ever known. They kept hearing about this God that was supposedly theirs, but they didn't have any physical representation of who that was. And so all the people around them and all their, even though they're enslaved for a big portion of that, they see these people worshiping idols. So how do you reconcile that? How do you put that together in your mind and in your heart? And that's one of the things that I remind our people as we're going through the Old Testament still, and is that, we have to understand that that's all that they ever knew. And when that's all you ever know, you still want to associate that And so and that's one of the way that the enemy gets his clutches into us, is we see that and we acquiesce to the society and culture rather than to what God has said. And when we take our eyes off of God, we have that tendency, because of our fallen nature, to, as it says in Ecclesiastes, the fool, he leans to the left. He goes to the left, and but the one who's wise in heart, he tends to the right. And the right is to seek out God. And that's one of the things that as non-believers, we're at war with God. We're declaring a whole different war there. And that's just the way that's why the gospel is so important, to understand that as you said, we're enemies of God. We're children of wrath, as it says in Ephesians. And that's the truth of how we are. And so the people were, they had slipped into paganism, and they were doing all these other things. And there in Babylon, they went from, where they could worship God without any representation, and just and it's what Habakkuk tells us, and what Paul tells us, is that the just or the righteous shall live by faith. And so you have to believe by faith, and without an idol, without a representation, without anything here that we can see, taste, touch, smell, so on and so forth. We just, because the Bible tells us that we are saved by grace, and that's His grace through faith, and that not of ourselves. That's not even of ourselves. It's totally of God, and so the people were struggling, and you think about it. You've been in a place for 70 years. This is all you've ever known. Some of the people were born there, and this is all they've ever seen is idolatry and all these other things. And they keep hearing about this God, but they're like, where's this God? He's done nothing for me. And so you have to, I think we have to understand that that's the way that we get. When things aren't working out the way that we thought they were in our lives, and somebody's introduced the idea of God, we often fall back into that place. And it's a dangerous place to wait around in, because within another foot or two, there's, it just drops down to, depths that we can't even count. And so that's one of the things that they were dealing with. God is reminding them about that. And one of the things that, maybe it's just my weirdness, but one of the things I love about Jesus in the New Testament, and about God in particular, is the fact that He just calls us out for what and who we are. And there's no hesitation. Hey, you guys are terrible. You're horrible. You're horrific sinners. Look at what you're doing. And then He names them, and He goes through all these different things. But then He reminds us, but if you just trust in me, it's going to be okay. And it's one of these things. Isaiah is always, I opened up a couple weeks ago and just said, I'm going to remind you again, there's a lot of contrasts. God is always contrasting, your disobedience with your obedience, and the different things that result as of that. And so it's just one of those things where the contrast, and even in this chapter in particular, it goes from one, and even when he's describing in the next portion of where we're going to be on Sunday, where I believe we're going to be, he's contrasting, he's making contrast, and it's kind of amazing, and it swings you back and forth, but it's really, really, it's refreshing, and it's also, it should cause us to go, whoa, because when we have a proper understanding, and when I say proper, I don't mean totally comprehensive understanding of who God is, because who can understand His holiness? I don't get that. I can't, because I'm not, and so but it gives us an idea of how God operates, and that the scary thing is that He not only knows what we're guilty of and what we do, both good and bad, but He knows what's going through our minds as we're doing it.
Well, that's just terrifying.
It
But
is.
what I'm sitting there as you're saying this, and nobody likes to be called out. Nobody likes to be called out. And you're absolutely right. The Bible is really offensive. I'm just gonna
Yeah.
say that. And everyone's like, oh, the God of the Old Testament is such a meanie pants, but the God of the New Testament is just so kind and sweet. Well, I don't know about that, friend. If you want to get down to it, because we are called out. Looking at Romans, right? The first whole chapter is telling us what rotten people we are, right? We're filled with all manner of unrighteousness. I'm on Romans 1:29 of unrighteousness, evil, covetousness, malice. We're full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, maliciousness. They're gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents. Yes, that's a sin, by the way. Foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless. It goes on and on and on. And then you can go, or like, but that, Heather, that's just Romans. That's just Romans. Maybe Paul had some bad sushi yesterday, and that's when he wrote that. But, Galatians is the same, right? I mean, we sit there and go to Galatians 5. If you're led by the Spirit, you are not under the law, but it says the works of the flesh are evident. Oh, okay, here it gets personal. Sexual immorality, impurity, sensuality, idolatry, sorcery, enmity, strife, jealousy, fits of anger. I mean, look at the road rage that we saw in the news just recently, right? Rivalries, dissensions, divisions, envy, drunkenness. It goes on and on and on.
Yeah.
Friend, we fall in virtually all of those categories, right? And James makes it pretty clear that, you know what, there is the law, and if you stumble at just one point of it, you broke the whole thing. It's an all or nothing thing. But that's kind. I want to just say, it's kind of the Lord to move the rock of our lives and expose all the creepy crawlies within.
Yeah.
I think it's very kind, because then it shows us what a depraved manner we live.
Yeah.
And it exposes our heart, and it reveals to us the fact that we need saving.
Yeah.
That everything I try to do, I could try to cover it up. That's not good enough.
Yeah.
That's not good enough. I mean, have you ever painted, maybe you have black mold or something, and you're like, what am I going to do with it? And so then you take the what is it called? The kills, right? And you try to kill it with that, and you're painting it. But you just kind of see the stuff kind of leaching out, right, into the surface again. That's what sin does, right?
Yeah.
We could try to cover it up all we want, but really our heart is just, it's gross, but that's the point. We need somebody who's going to take care of that sin. To just get rid of it. And we need to be absolutely new. We can't do that.
Right.
We need a savior. We need somebody who knows us and exposes every little creepy crawly, so that we can live in newness of life, free from all of that, right? Corey, what do you say about that?
Yeah, it's a reminder that God doesn't have to turn a blind eye in order to love you. Because I think our version of love, and a lot of times the culture is like, what we mean by love, we say love is blind, right?
Yeah.
But love isn't blind.
Correct.
God's love is actually the opposite. It is the most visually acute and aware that it could possibly be, and chooses to love us anyway. And so I think there's a lot of power there. Pastor Rudy, maybe getting back into Isaiah 57 here where we are. He's using an analogy, right, in the verses in 6 through 13. He's using an analogy that is a physical analogy to portray the spiritual reality that they're facing. Could you maybe unpack some of that for us?
Yeah. When you read these passages, he's calling them out on all the things that they're guilty of, and really what has happened is they've fallen into apostasy.
I would even say, though, they didn't fall; they jumped right in head first.
Yeah, and like I said, earlier, remember that some of them did that, and that's all that they ever knew. That's what their fathers taught them. So they're just carrying on that tradition, and he actually says that. But the one thing that spiritually is they had become spiritually dead. And that's it's a picture of what's being painted here is a picture of us, as we've been talking. It's a picture of humanity in writ large, because we are that way, and we really, when we're honest, when we become born again, one of the things that I think happens is we begin to unpack our lives and we see ourselves in the mirror as who we really are, and it forces us to be honest. And one of the things that it does is it forces us to see that we're haters of God. And that's what they had become. It wasn't just that they were where's God? And I'm questioning whether there even is a God. It was beyond that, as they had gone after these things, and like you said, like they jumped into it. They really went after it with gusto. And maybe for some of, if there's some younger people, gusto, it just means they went all out. And what they did, one of the scary things is what God says is in many different places in Isaiah. He says, and you were purposely provoking me to anger. That's a scary thought. Like, you're poking me in the eye. You're almost daring me to do something about this. And God was relenting. He does say, I turned my face from all that, and I just turned away in my anger. And that's probably a very good thing, because in his anger, in his wrath, like you were saying earlier, we have this idea of love, and we also have this culturized idea of this drippy, sticky, slobbery kind of just God that is just, all he is love. And we don't have to worry about anything. And that's the enemy. That's the enemy that puts that in our minds, and when we begin to unpack that. And like you said, it's offensive to hear any other, the idea. I like what Vodi Bakum said, that a lot of people that don't even claim to believe in God, they blame God and say, well, the God of the Old Testament is, like you said, this big meanie. He says, but, and at the time when he's, there's a video of him where he says this, he says, we're actually in our congregation, we're finishing up the book of Revelation. And he says, if you want to see a God who is angry, you need to read to the end of the book. It's not just on that side, the left side of the book. It's on the right side. And you'll see that he's still the same God, and fiercely so. And spiritually, they had apostatized. They had provoked God to anger. And in doing these things, and they had forgotten the goodness of God. They had forgotten that in spite of that. And I love what you said about the fact that when we see love, when we think about love, we have this misconception. And that's one of the things that when I'm counseling somebody to be married, that's one of the things that we talk about. And one of the definitions of love that I like to use is what the Bible shows us, is God knows everything about you. He knows every single flaw. He knows every single fault. He knows your thought life, and he still chooses to love you. And he still chooses to forgive you, and he still chooses to interact with and have that interpersonal relationship with you. And he has chosen that from eternity. And that's what his decision was before he made anything. This is what I've decided that I'm going to do. And that's what actually love is taking a person with flaws and all, knowing those things and saying, you know what, I'm going to love them anyways. And that's what he's doing here. He's showing them, you're apostatizing, you're provoking me, you're worshiping demonic beings, you're offering your sacrifices, you're doing all these things, and you're also sacrificing your children. And I see all that. But I love the way that the way that verse 13 ends when he says, "But he who takes refuge in me shall inherit the land and shall possess my holy mountain." And God is saying you're spiritually dead, and I could say you're dead to me, right? But he doesn't choose to do that. He still gives that inkling of hope, that the wonder of God's grace, that if you take refuge in me, if you find your hope in me, if you place that and trust in me, you're going to possess the land. It's going to work out okay. And I love how that dovetails into what Paul teaches in Romans chapter 8. Is that where you were going?
I was going to go to Romans 11, but along the way.
Yeah, Romans chapter 8, where he says, God, and we know that God works all things together for good to those who love God, who are called according to his purpose, and the golden chain of redemption, where he says that everything that God, that happens in your life, God will use for good. But please hear me, those who are listening, for those who love God. I've heard it, other people say, and they're as far as I was, and maybe not quite as far as I was, but people just use that. Oh, God will work everything out for good. It's like, have you actually read that? Because it's important, that last part, for those who love God. God will use everything, and in this instance, that's exactly what he's doing. All of that stuff, and God indicts them. This is what you're guilty of. But regardless of all that, the one who takes refuge in me is going to possess the land.
So what's in Romans 11?
Well, it's just this idea. So Paul's talking about, Israel has rejected God, and so he's, opening up the door to the Gentiles, which was prophesied not only in Isaiah but elsewhere, right?
Yeah.
You talked about that shift where Jesus is basically saying, look, your point of blessing was ultimately to point people to me, not for yourself. I wasn't all about you the whole time, and now I'm just changing. He's like, the whole point was to bring to the whole world, and that was the promise, right? What did Jesus say to Abraham? What did God say to Abraham? He said, in you, all the nations of the world will be blessed, right? So it always was that. But interesting, in verse 22 of Romans 11, it says this, therefore, consider the goodness and the severity of God. On those who fell, severity, but towards you, goodness, if you continue in his goodness. Otherwise, you also will be cut off. Verse 23, and they also, if they do not continue in unbelief, will be grafted in, for God is able to graft them in again. And so he had been using this idea, this analogy of a tree, right? And he's basically saying that Israel was the original tree, but the branches are being cut off because they're choosing to walk in unbelief. And that's really what we're dealing with in Isaiah, right?
Exactly, yeah.
It's the same thing.
Yeah.
So
they had forgotten, and it was one of those things where not only had they forgotten, they just substituted. And that's one of it's syncretizing. We're going to worship this as if it was God, and including our worship with God, and that is the epitome of total, in your face offense, and that's what was angering God, is that they were doing this as if he was involved in that, and he had nothing to do with it, and that's one of the things that he's saying there. The duplicity of the people was he was calling out, and what he was angry about.
Heather, could I ask you a question? I'm curious to what you think,
The
and
answer's
Pastor
purple.
Rudy too. Right? I'm just wondering: is there a sense in which the duplicity that you're talking about, Pastor Rudy, is the duplicity worse than just being honest and rejecting God outright? Is there a sense in which where they're blending the worship and trying to sort of play both? Is that more problematic than people, in a sense, than people who just say, oh, I'm going to be honest about this, I just reject God, I don't want him, versus people who are saying, well, I'm going to kind of play the game, I'm going to make God in my image, I'm going to do my thing? Would you say that there's a different level there of I don't know if the word is just rebellion against God? I mean, because it's clearly rebellion if you're going the other way.
Yeah.
But do you have any thoughts on, even both of you, thoughts on what does it look like whenever we try to play the game with God as opposed to just being straightforward about, hey, you've offered yourself to me, I reject you, I'm doing my own thing, versus I want to do both, Lord. I'm going to play the good parts of what you have, but then I'm going to integrate false worship into that.
Well, if you're asking me, it's rejection of God either way.
Either way.
I mean,
Okay.
I just, because at the end of the day, you have to say, who is God, right? And if you are building up for yourself a God of your own choosing, which is basically what you're doing, then you're no better than the folks in Isaiah 57 who have done exactly that same thing, right? If hedging your bets is no faith at all, right? At least, and I'm a little bit more like, if God says it, you believe it, or you're not following him. And I just remember, it was Charles Stanley, 100 years ago, one of his things, he said, worshiping God is serious business. And I think, especially Americans today, we are very flippant. And we think, God, there's this book that was called Gentle and Lowly that came out. It was like this huge flaming success. But at the same time, there was another book called Rejoice and Tremble. I feel like America, we're so busy saying, God just loves me and he's so focused on me. We need to focus on God. We need to fear and tremble before him, because when you take his holiness against us, that's just what Isaiah did earlier in, was it 6, where it was like, woe is me, I'm a man.
Isaiah 5, yeah.
5, yeah. Woe is me, I'm a man of unclean lips, from a people of unclean. Like he saw the holiness of God and he was undone. You look at Daniel, the same thing. He just saw, and he was like falling on the ground as a dead man.
Yeah.
I mean, if we truly understood the holiness and sovereignty and power of God, we would not be flippant and saying, oh, you know what? But I'm going to take a little bit of this too. We would never do that. We would never do that. We would take God at His word and we would follow Him. And we're just, I'm a little bit
Yeah.
strong about that, just
Yeah.
because why would we?
Yeah.
Why would we do that?
Yeah, and I think on this, I think similarly, that's one of the things, and that's one of the things that we need to be really careful about. I mean, like, it is a serious thing to worship God, and I can't remember. I think maybe it was R.C. Sproul that I was listening to, who said that one of the most dangerous things is one of the most dangerous things that people participate in on a weekly basis is a Sunday morning church service, because many people are playing and they're being duplicitous, and they're going to be held accountable for hearing the gospel being preached, if it's being preached and boldly, and what are they doing with that? And if they're just, like going on with life, and they're guilty of having heard, they will never, and it's like Paul says in Romans that, and by the way, that was Isaiah 6. When you said "woe," my mind went to "woe to them who call dark light evil good," but it was 6. That yeah. So, it's one of those things that it is dangerous. It's a dangerous game to play. I did a message when we were going through Deuteronomy years ago, and I did a message that said, "God, don't play." That was the title of the message. And it's one of those things where God just he's straight up. He doesn't mince words, and it's one of those things where, as I was saying earlier, where Jesus, even in the Gospels, he's in the midst of crowds, and he says, you being sinners, if you give good gifts to your kids, he's proclaiming this, and there's this, and it's not small crowds that are following. And sometimes we think it's just 12 people that are following. No, there's huge crowds that are following him, and he's saying this to everybody, you being sinners, and he's talking to the priests and the Sadducees and the Pharisees and the scribes and all these guys as well, the elders, the leaders of the city. He's talking to everybody, and he says, you being sinners. And oftentimes we look at stuff like that and we just read past it and don't think about it. This is God calling us what we are. And he's making that contrast, and he's saying, but this is who I am, and this is what I'm going to do. And in that particular passage, I think it's in Matthew where he says that. But it's in Matthew, it's in Mark, and it's in Luke in particular, where he does call out the crowds. And what's weird is we don't get a reaction from the writers. Like, if you're in the crowd and you hear this Messiah, this rabbi that you're following, this teacher, and you're wanting to glean some wisdom from him, and he calls you a sinner, we're going to shut down usually. And I ain't hearing that. I ain't about that. I'm not going to. Who is he to be able to call me? But you don't hear that response. It's like it just went over their head. But God, that's the way that He is. He talks to us in that very straightforward way. And so we have to understand. One of the things that I think is dangerous about religion is religion will always give you kind of if you just do enough of this or do enough of that, or if you just act this way towards people, then that's going to kind of counter the places where you're deficient. And true biblical Christianity says, no, we're totally rotten, we're awful. When I like what Martin Luther said, when the devil reminds me of my sin, I remind him of his future. And he's like, he said, and then in another one, he said, in another quote that he says, I think this was Charles Spurgeon, where he says, when the devil reminds me of my sin, I'm rejoicing, because my Savior, my Jesus, paid for my sin, and I'm redeemed. And it's one of those things where that's what true Christianity is. We have assurance that, no, God has saved me. I'm saved. That's a done deal. And all the things that happen afterwards are a result of that. An acknowledgement that we know that we're different. We see it, and other people see it in our lives. And here, the spiritual condition of the people was not good.
Yeah.
They were still practicing religion, right? But it was of their own making, and it was of another kind.
Yeah.
And that's what gets us in trouble. And that's why I think, right now the proclamation of the gospel is one of the most important things, because we have to warn people that there is a judgment that is coming, and every single person is going to face that. And I like to say often that, look, every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. The question is when. When will you do that? Are you going to do it on this side while you have an opportunity? Because afterwards, there ain't no more opportunity. It's gone.
Yeah.
And you will. And I've had discussions with people, and they say, well, I don't believe that. Like, that's irrelevant. You're going to.
'Cause
Period.
that's what
End
the
of
Word
story.
of God says,
Yes,
right? And it's
absolutely.
not like people are trying to be angry with you, or when you hear things like that, like, nah, no. That's what the Bible says. I mean, I'm a human being, and so I like to I don't like confrontation, and I like to make things all flowery and happy, and there's unicorns everywhere. But the fact of the matter, it doesn't matter what I believe; it's what God says, and that's why the Bible is so very important. And I think back to, if I were to answer your question again, I would also say this: God does not share his glory with anyone.
Correct.
God says he's a jealous God, not jealous of you, but jealous for you. He wants your affection. He is the one who only deserves your affection, to be honest with you. And so when you start being duplicitous, and maybe you're like, you were part of a religious tradition, but then you're seeing the stuff in the Bible, like, but I will take these other traditions. Friend, that's not truth. It's still not truth. You can add a little bit of truth to your lie, still not truth. You can have truth and then throw a little lie in there. It's still not truth, right? It's God or nothing. He's the only one who deserves your affections, right? And he's the one who says, this is who I am. I think going back to Isaiah 57, these people were probably serving God at the temple and then going up to these high places and doing horrendous things and saying, yeah, I hedged my bets. Yeah. Here's the problem. He says, who did you dread and fear so that you lied and did not remember me, did not lay it to your to heart? Have I not held my peace even for a long time? And that's a long suffering of God, right? But the problem is you did not fear me. I will declare your righteousness and your deeds, but they will not profit you. When you cry out, let your collection of idols deliver you. Jesus says that no one can serve two masters. You're going to despise one and love the other. That's how it always is. And you know what? If you got that idol in front of you that's showing you, like, being really squishy and saying, oh, you could do all of these wonderful things, you're going to go for that one every time, and because it's going to feed your flesh. But God has something better for you.
Yeah, no, just totally agree. It's interesting because idols really just allow us to be our own gods, but put that on the God. That's not, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, that's really all it is. It's just, we know that God doesn't change internally, right? Romans chapter 2 even talks about our conscience, that God has written his law in our hearts.
Yeah.
So we know it. But what we do is we take these idols. First of all, we do it because we're created to be worshipful beings, right? So God created us that way. But secondarily, we don't want to just come right out and say, oh, I worship myself, I'll do it that way. So we create these idols so that we can ascribe our own set of worship laws or our own set of morality standards to these things. That way we sort of give ourselves a pass. But at the end of the day, there's only two that you can worship, either the Lord or yourself.
Yeah, exactly.
Well said. But he who takes refuge in me shall possess the land. Or in our situation, we actually are his, right?
Amen.
Yeah.
And God is the only one who, well, where else are you going to go? That's the question. It's like, where else are you going to go? Take refuge in the Lord who made you, who created you, who loves you. He's long suffering, right? He's died for you. Who's died for you? What? You don't even die for yourself. I mean, it's the Lord who has done all these things for you, friend. And so he's the one, again, who deserves your affection and adoration. We have like a minute left. What do you want us to walk away with?
The words of Peter, and you kind of hit on it, where I think it was Peter that said, when he was asked with the question, "Are you going to leave?" in the Gospel of John, and he's, "Where else can we go? You have the words of life." And he could have said, "You are the words of life." And that's the thing is, there's no other person or there's no other place that you can go except to Jesus. Go to Jesus. He will save you.
I love it. I love it. Friend, we really recommend you go to a Bible teaching, Jesus loving church family in your local area. If you are in Provo, maybe consider Calvary City on a Hill.
Yeah.
How would we connect with you?
We're at 105 East, 100 North, and cityonahillut.org.
Perfect. Pastor Rudy Rodriguez, thank you.
Yeah.
Short notice and you came in and this has been so good. Dear friend, keep reading God's word and remember that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life.